Thank you, Christoph, very much. I think Christoph is probably, is this coming through? Can people hear? Okay, I'll try to speak. Is that better? I suspect also, and I should apologise at the beginning, that my accent might be difficult for a number of people, and my apologies that I can't speak German, because I take it that most people here would be German speakers, even if they're not originally from Germany. But I will try to go a little slowly, so the unusual accent, some people say really ugly accent, a lot of people don't like Australian accent, won't be quite so difficult, I hope. Thank you very much, Christoph, for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here, and I think it looks an absolutely wonderful place, one we would really envy in Australian academia, extremely so. Okay, what I am going to do is talk about Lord Howe Island in a little while. I want to really present a problem that is without, I think, an obvious solution, and one that we keep trying to chip away at in national parks in Australia, of which Lord Howe Island is also, of course, a World Heritage Area. But first, as land across the world is occupied by ever-expanding human populations, and the plants and animals they deliberately or adventitiously introduce, mediation between competing claims of wilderness ecosystems, animals, both free, domesticated, wild, the ones in human captivity or human slavery, and humans themselves has become increasingly urgent. While the right of humans to occupy available space is usually taken for granted, except for internecine human competition over it, conflict over the remainder often arises between those who champion the rights, or perhaps less philosophically and legalistically, what I'd prefer to call the interests of individual animals, and environmental conservation conservation proponents who regard individual animals usually simply as very necessary ecosystem components, important as species, but not individually, or conversely, but again as a species, as destructive or disruptive ecological intruders to be exiled out of that ecosystem or totally exterminated. This is the particular situation or clash I want to examine here, but I might mention before I move on, and Christoph has already prepared you for some of these dreadful ideas, before I move on, that there are, of course, other important conflicts. As a radical environmentalist, and I define that in my case as someone who sees the artificial barriers we have erected between our species and others in order to retain our absolute fiefdom over the planet and other animals, I'd see that barrier, animal-human, as important to erode philosophically and actually, and in the work I do, that's one of the main things I do, is keep trying to chip away at those artificial barriers, humans, animals, even though we know we're animals in certain contexts, we don't want to recognise it in others. And secondly, I see human overpopulation as the root cause of all our environmental problems today, from air and water pollution through climate change to energy use, And I believe the right of humans to endlessly reproduce themselves needs at least some discussion. It cannot be a do not touch issue that's simply taken for granted. It must, I think, be discussed, but few people want to do it, and even fewer politicians want to tangle with it. And thirdly, while I work for or try to live sustainably as far as possible, because these other things are things that will have to go beyond my lifetime if they go at all. And I think sustainable living in many ways is the band-aid that we can put on trying to halt environmental destruction and destruction of animal habitats. I'm a bit suspicious of the term sustainability. It usually means just human sustainability, and in terms of urban-suburban space can, for instance, support factory farming over free range at the expense of animals and environment. For insustainability, I think animals and environment are not necessarily included for their own sakes unless their preservation contributes materially or spiritually to ours. And you may certainly, since I think most of you are probably interested in sustainability, and I realise this is a very green government and I envy you, your green government, but you might want to challenge me on that sustainability and tell me that what I'm saying about my suspicions about the word sustainability are not correct. But the particular conflict today, broadly speaking, is the one I want to look at is between animal interest proponents and environment or conservationists, two groups who should be working side by side against a human majority that is in general commercial, greedy, self-interested, for progress, and also carnivorous in general, at the expense of both environment and other animals. As Mark Sagoff, and you probably know this article, in his wonderfully entitled article, Bad Marriage, Quick Divorce, considers the differing philosophical positions of Aldo Leopold, Christopher Stone and Lawrence Tribe on the one hand, and Peter Singer on the other. Summarising the argument of the environmental ethicist, Sagoff notes that while Leopold, Stone and Tribe argue for the expansion of moral boundaries to include not only humans but soils, waters, plants and animals, Peter Singer, using the analogy between human liberation movements and the extension of rights to other animal species, does not include rocks, trees, lakes or mountains within the community of morally significant beings. For Singer, only entities capable of subjective experiences can have interests in the full sense of the term. Well, these differing positions are well known, and I find I agree, in fact, with both of them. I think it's Bolivia that has written into its constitution recently, but also Colombia, the rights of the earth, which I think is a wonderful thing to have done. Whether they can sustain it, because the rights of the earth written into a couple of South American constitutions would protect the earth from mining, and I think that would be fantastic. Whether they can sustain that economically is a different position. But these differing philosophical positions are well known through that essay of Sagoff's, if not otherwise, and it's a very old essay now. And he goes on to explore that particular disagreement. But I want to go back to the one with which I started, which exists within that area that he's talking about, but doesn't stress the philosophical positions particularly, but looks at the different positions of environmentalists and animal ethicists generally. For rights proponents, animals are individuals. For conservationists in general, they are species. As John Coetzee, Nobel Prize-winning novelist, has his character Elizabeth Costello put it in his work The Lives of Animals. In the ecological vision, the salmon and the waterweed and the insects interact in a great complex dance with the earth, with the weather. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. In the dance, each organism has a role. It is these multiple roles, rather than the particular beings who play them, that participate in the dance. As for actual players, as long as they are self-renewing, as long as they keep coming forward, we need pay them no heed. Unless, of course, that ecosystem includes us, and then it's a very different matter. But in terms of conservation and animal interests, there's another subset involved here, at least for national parks in places like Australia, New Zealand, North America. And that is, or areas where we want to preserve, certainly, biodiversity. There are concepts of indigenous versus non-indigenous and feral or invasive species. These are not always fixed, and they can change roles over time. Something that was once invasive can be seen eventually as indigenous. Sometimes something that can be seen as indigenous is given a different value ascription and suddenly finds itself challenged by commercial or local interests. The indigenous is not always valued over the introduced or alien, but in general, parks and wildlife in Australia, New Zealand, the US seek to recreate the environment before the arrival of Europeans, and in so doing produce situations, of course, where certain decisions have to be made. The first decision that's usually made is the time at which you want that environment to return to. And in Australia, Cook allegedly discovered Australia for Europeans. Of course, its indigenous human inhabitants had been there for millennia, but Cook arrives in 1770, and it's the 1770 landscape that parks and wildlife seek to preserve. So there's that strange initial decision to stop any kind of evolutionary continuance after 1770. I want to use the example of the island on which I live that Christoph has already mentioned to look at some of the problems that arise when you get this clash of indigenous, non-indigenous, and the value ascriptions attributed to species, the value ascriptions then attributed to individual animals, and the kind of clashes these produce. It is, as Christoph said, an isolated volcanic island, 10 kilometres long, 2 kilometres wide, 700 kilometres from the Australian mainland. I'll just see if I can throw up a couple of slides of it. I'm afraid these aren't necessarily in order. As Christoph also said, we're a bit technologically backward. I had to get someone to give me an SBS drive, but I had no knowledge really of what was on it till I got here. Another view of, I just said, please put on some rats and some general bird pictures. This is the cloud forest on top of the highest mountain, which is 850 metres high, and that's very high for a mountain in Australia. And the cloud forest generates its own flora. On Lord Howe there are 105, what have I done here? 105 species. I think I've I may need a little help to get rid of the, so I can get on,
the right person to help.
so I can get on to the next slide. Yep, that should do it. Yep, thanks. That's the island itself, and the cloud forest you just saw a photo of is on top of that highest mountain, Mount Gower. Isolated, volcanic, 700 kilometres from the mainland. It was not on any Indigenous people's routes to New Zealand or to anywhere else, so no humans had ever been there before 1789, when the first fleet that went to Australia from England made a return voyage and happened on it accidentally. The sailors on that first voyage discovered a local species of bird, the woodhen, and the woodhen they thought very good eating. The woodhens had never seen humans before, so the woodhens came right on out, surrounded the sailors. They found they hardly had to get up to club them to death. But then they found there was an even easier way. If they broke their legs, the woodhens made a noise that called other woodhens all round, so they managed to, in very human fashion, replenish their supply of meat in a very easy way. The woodhens went down to numbers of 12 by 1980, due in part to the arrival of rats on a boat in 1918. When a boat ran aground in 1918, rats came ashore. Pigs and goats were brought by the settlers in the middle of the 19th century, and they disturbed the woodhen habitat so badly that by the 1980s there were, they think, 11 or 12 at most left. It is a success story in that the woodhen has now been able to be brought back to about 200 in numbers, but it's still one of the rarest birds in the world. Presumably, it's thought, descended from the New Zealand kiwi. It's flightless and differs greatly from the kiwi in a number of aspects, but probably came from there. Of all the flora and fauna on Lord Howe, of which in terms of flora there are 105 totally indigenous species not found anywhere else, including your pot plant, their origins are New Zealand, Norfolk Island, it would seem, Vanuatu, the Australian mainland, and two very strange plants whose only relatives are in South Africa. It's thought that they arrived somehow by bird. Okay, discovered in 1789, not settled until the mid-19th century, but immediately cats, pigs, goats, though cats were never much of a problem because they stayed in the very lower settlement areas and tended not to stray into the mountains where the woodhens could also go. Before it became a World Heritage Area but became a protected area, the pigs and goats that had been introduced by humans, of course, but are always spoken of as the pests. The pests of the pigs and goats were shot out in general, except for two goats, two female goats, it's thought, who still survive in the mountains, so no one's seen them for quite some time. They used that technique that some of you may know of putting a Judas goat. Do you know what that is? Amongst the flock. You put a goat with a electronic recorder on, and then you can trace where the goats have gone and get in a helicopter and shoot them, hence the term Judas goat. So the pigs were shot out by the late 1980s, and then more or less all of the goats. The idea now is that the one pest remaining would seem to be the rat. The rats, to my mind, have come to a degree of accommodation, certainly with the woodhens, for whose demise they're held in part responsible, but they do attack other seabirds in the nests, as you see there. At the moment, there are control systems in place where particular I don't know what you'd call those things, rat traps are put out with poison in them, and the rats go in, eat the poison, and are killed. It's a hemorrhagic poison. It's a particularly awful death, like Ebola, which is also a hemorrhagic in Africa. But this is the philosophy of control. The philosophy of eradication on islands all around the world was introduced by New Zealand, who set up a business, the New Zealand Parks and Wildlife, together with the New Zealand government, set up a business in dropping a substance called broad AFRICOM, which is related to talon, another rat poison to which rats in Australia have now become immune. You hire the helicopters. The helicopters spend 2 days carpet bombing, basically, the entire environment with broad AFRICOM. The reason that is allegedly successful is because when rats see other rats go into here and eat the poison, it takes the rats a couple of days to die or a few days to die. They know not to eat it, and they stop. They're very, very smart creatures, rats. But with broad AFRICOM, if it's eaten immediately, its action is quicker. The rats don't have time to learn not to eat it. So 3 years ago, the Australian government gave Lord Howe $8 million to eradicate rats on Lord Howe by this New Zealand carpet bombing drop of broad AFRICOM. Since then, there have been wrangles of all kinds on the island. The poison drop is now postponed to 2016, but it is thought it will still go ahead, and it's a very fractious issue, not only on the island itself, but on the mainland from where a lot of our tourists come. I might say a lot of our tourists also come from Germany, because a German film crew made a wonderful film of Lord Howe, and I think it's the best we've ever had made, because they took photos of the bad weather as well as the good weather. Most of the tourist ones just take photos of the nice weather, but the German video covers the whole year. First of all, in considering the problems this has raised, one, the rats themselves. If you are an animal ethicist, you do not like the way the rats die from hemorrhagic poison, you don't like the way they do now, but this of course would be infinitely worse. If you are an animal ethicist, you really do not like, and this is my particular objection, the so-called by-kill that will occur. The by-kill that will occur will affect about 15 bird species on the island. They will all die. They have all got themselves there, but they've got themselves there since 1788, so they're not seen as indigenous in that sense. In order to protect the woodhens and the other 3 species of indigenous Lord Howe Island birds, that is those who were there before 1770, all kinds of measures will be taken. Most of the woodhens will be corralled, and they're very territorial, but they've tried this out and say it will work. Corralled in a small cage on the island and protected from the broad AFRICOM. All the dogs will have to be muzzled for 6 months. We have dogs on the island but no cats. All the cattle will have to be taken off the island for the time and later brought back again because they'll eat the broad AFRICOM, which is green, in the grass. The Lord Howe Island currawong, which will be very hard to catch, they will try to catch 40% of them and isolate them, but the others will simply die. Let me say that there are not a lot of people that share my objections to broad AFRICOM in terms of the bikill. Most of the people on the island, however, are against this poison drop for the reason that they think it may in the end affect humans through the food chain, from people who've thought about the food chain to people who say two-headed children will be born. I doubt this is the case since it's a hemorrhagic poison, but so the strong objections from the island are coming not from the scientists who are very much in favour of this, but from people who in some cases radically, I think, misunderstand the nature of the poison, but in others, sensing or having read Rachel Carson and DDT, see broad AFRICOM as potentially affecting the food chain and affecting the island in other ways. Now, it has been tested on a number of islands, but to my knowledge it's never been tested in a situation where immediate runoff might affect the marine park environment. It's been tested on mussels, it has never been tested on coral. The problem for the coral is that though we have not anything like the same number of species of coral that the Great Barrier Reef does, the Great Barrier Reef, as it actually says in the latest Scientific American in your coffee room, is under great threat from a whole number of pressures at the moment. The hope is that the Lord Howe's Reef, being the most southerly lagoon reef in the world, might just act as a reservoir during climate change for at least some coral species, because those species are moving south, and they certainly are in Australia with climate change. The one lot of lagoon reef that they hope will be preserved will be off Lord Howe. So the broad AFRICOM drop potentially could threaten the coral. Some scientists think there should be more tests on that, others don't. The further reason, well, the main reason for expelling the rats, that although we would get immediate bikill in the bird populations, especially seabird populations, would increase radically after the rats had gone. There's also one other aspect to this. An insect called the phasmid, which is about this long, went extinct after 1918 on Lord Howe because the rats thought it was the most wonderful meal I think they'd ever seen. And the phasmids are they're not attractive looking animals. A Danish friend of mine said if they're released on Lord Howe again, there'll never be any more tourists. But they were thought to be extinct until they were discovered on a rock, 5 of them, still clinging to a rock off Lord Howe. They thought they were there because they'd found a dead body, but they could never find the phasmids until somebody climbed the rock at night, and they found 5 of them. So 3 of them were taken to the mainland. They were clinging to tiny, scrubby little bushes on this rock, and it was thought that that was all they ate. In fact, when they took them to the mainland, they found they would eat anything green in sight. They'd just been stuck on Ball's Pyramid for about a century and had nothing to eat except these scrubby little bushes. When they were a part of the ecosystem on Lord Howe, however, they were kept in check, not by rats, which didn't arrive till 1918, but by the Lord Howe Island parrot, a specific parrot that was shot out by the early settlers because it fed on their grain. If the phasmids were now released, the rats eradicated, the question again arises, would the phasmids eat everything green in sight? And a further reason for eradicating the rats was not just the seabirds, the return of the phasmid, but in fact the rats threaten quite a number of indigenous plant species on Lord Howe. So as you see, this question, what do you do in a national park when you have all these complicated, and I don't know the answer to this, all these complicated areas to consider. As I said, as an animal ethicist, I do not like the way the rats are currently killed or would be killed by broad AFRICOM, but in particular I object strongly to the by-kill and to the way in which those birds and animals would die individually, even if the species were to either be reintroduced deliberately or were to find their way back again as they did originally through a particular flight path or wind and so on. This is just an example of the non-Indigenous species that have come in and have some not destructive, some fairly destructive, though of course let us remember that humans are the ones who brought them here. They didn't, most of them except for the blackbird in the corner, make their own way, though there is an argument that the blackbird may have been brought over by somebody. We still allow dogs, but they must be kept on a leash unless they're in the home. But the plover is an interesting example of a bird that found its own way to Lord Howe, but post-1770 and would be probably exterminated by the broad AFRICOM. There's Mr. Rattus Rattus. I should admit perhaps at this stage that I had a pet rat, so I'm quite in favour of rats. I doubt you can see the detail of this, but this is a wonderful cartoon drawn up by an artist on the island of everything that the rats eat. I'm not quite sure if I can make it any bigger, and I probably can't, but you see the rats carting off a lot of seeds, a lot of fruit, eating at the rat restaurant, and at the rat restaurants they can eat other birds. This is done in order to try to convert some of the Lord Howe Islanders to the extermination of the rat eating a bird's egg, destruction of seeds of native plants by rats. There's a native snail that is also threatened by the rats. This is a red-tailed tropic bird, one of the species that is thought would come back in far greater numbers if the rats were exterminated because their eggs are eaten by the rats. These are the only vertebrate animals native to Lord Howe Island, and again, not so much are they attacked by rats, though I think they occasionally are, but it's habitat loss again. These fairy terns are subject to attack by the rats. So I have no idea how this will play out in the end. It's impossible for the various scientists and the government to do the rat drop without the consent of the Lord Howe Island people themselves, because in order to be effective it has to be a total eradication. And I have a problem with the fact that control and eradication have never been really debated in relation to this issue. But with this alleged total eradication, we would get, again, more fairy terns, though we have a lovely lot of fairy terns who are wonderful little animals at the moment. So at the moment it's still an issue. Some people say they will lie down in front of the helicopters or disable the helicopters, although it's a criminal offence, if they try to drop it. A lot of tourists are against it because they say a pristine environment will be thoroughly poisoned. But I see it as the consideration of individual animals and the way individuals die. And let us remember that most experiments that have led to human change have been done on rats, and they've been done on rats because, as the American Veterinary Association belatedly acknowledged, if in fact we can show all kinds of things from rat experiments, we can also think the other way and see how rats, like us, in fact suffer a similar deal. That basically is the end of my talk, but in talking to Christoph, I happened to mention, and the slides are here, that although we are 700 kilometres out in the Pacific, we still get plastic debris. And that is a bad day with plastic debris, but its major impact has been on fleshy-footed shearwaters who pick it up from the open ocean and then go back and feed the chicks, fleshy-footed shearwater chicks, with the bits of plastic. And increasingly we've had vast numbers of fleshy-footed shearwater chicks dying because they have been fed plastic. They starve to death because they get no nourishment. The other experiment currently being conducted with the fleshy-footed shearwaters who migrate between Japan and Lord Howe Island is to see whether the Fukushima meltdown actually has affected the birds, and there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest that the birds are now coming back to Lord Howe with a reading of quite high radioactivity, even though of course it's one whole hemisphere to the other. So I'll stop there with that little addenda at the end. Thank you.